The millionaire buys an orphanage to prevent its demolition, but didn't expect the orphanage director to be his teenage sweetheart. The numbers on Maxwell Porter's phone screen made his stomach turn. Another $3 million gone from his acquisition fund. Not because of bad investments or market downturns, those he could handle, but because his board of trustees had rejected his proposal to save the Heritage House Children's Home. Again. With all due respect, Mr. Porter. Lawrence Chen, his chief financial officer, leaned forward across the mahogany conference table. Buying a failing orphanage isn't exactly what our shareholders expect from Boston's fastest-growing real estate development firm. Max ran his fingers through his salt and pepper hair, a habit from his younger days that survived his transformation from scrappy entrepreneur to polished CEO. At 42, he'd built Porter Development from nothing into a billion-dollar enterprise. But this project meant more than money. The land value alone is exactly why Criterion Properties wants to demolish it and build luxury condos, Lawrence interrupted. They've already secured the permits. The sale is practically final. Then I'll buy it with my personal funds. Max stood, straightening his charcoal suit jacket. Schedule a meeting with their CEO. Max. Today, Lawrence. 30 minutes later, Max's driver pulled up to Heritage House, a Victorian mansion that had served as a haven for orphaned children for over a century. Its faded red brick and weathered white trim spoke of decades of tight budgets and deferred maintenance, but there was dignity in its bones. He needed to see it one more time before making his pitch to Criterion's CEO. As he approached the worn stone steps, a child's laughter drew his attention to the side yard. A group of young children clustered around a woman who sat cross-legged on a checkered blanket, reading from a worn copy of Where the Wild Things Are. Her auburn hair caught the afternoon sun, and something about her animated gestures tugged at his memory. And Max wore his wolf suit, she read, her voice shifting with each character. Max froze. That voice. He knew that voice. The woman looked up, probably sensing his presence. Her green eyes widened with recognition, and the book slipped from her fingers. Rebecca. His voice came out barely above a whisper. Max Porter. Rebecca Martinez stood slowly, smoothing her simple navy dress. The children looked between them, sensing the sudden tension in the air. I didn't expect to see Boston's famous developer at our humble home. 25 years dissolved in an instant. He was 17 again, stealing kisses with Becca behind the bleachers at Brighton High, making plans for a future they were too young to understand. Before his father's death had forced him to drop out and take over the family's struggling construction business. Before unanswered calls and unsent letters had turned into years of silence. I'm the director here, she said, her professional tone at odds with the emotion he saw flash across her face. Have you come to personally deliver the news about Criterion's plans? Actually, Max started, but was interrupted by a small boy tugging at Rebecca's dress. Miss Becca, is he a prince? The child whispered loudly, earning giggles from his companions. Rebecca's stern expression cracked slightly. No, Danny, Mr. Porter is a businessman. She turned back to Max, her voice cooling. Who was just leaving? I need to talk to you, Max said quickly. What about Heritage House? There's nothing to discuss. We've been trying to reach Criterion's board for weeks, but they won't even take our calls. We have 38 children here, Max. 38 children who need stability, not luxury condos. The pain in her voice hit him like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a property deal anymore. This was about Rebecca, the girl who'd once told him she wanted to change the world, one child at a time, who apparently had been doing exactly that while he'd been building his empire. That's why I'm here, Max said, taking a step forward. I want to help. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, and he saw the shadows of their shared past dance across her features. Finally, she turned to the children. Story time's over, everyone. Please go find Mrs. Chen for your art lesson. As the children reluctantly filed inside, Rebecca faced Max again. My office is this way. You have 15 minutes to explain why I should believe anything you have to say. Max followed her up the worn steps, his mind racing. He had come to Heritage House prepared to make a business decision. Now, With every click of Rebecca's sensible heels on the hardwood floors, he realized he was walking into something far more complicated. The past he'd thought safely buried was very much alive, and it was about to collide head-on with his present. Rebecca's office was exactly what Max would have expected from her. Organized chaos, with children's artwork covering one wall and carefully labeled filing cabinets lining another. A worn leather couch beneath a window suggested late nights spent working, while a small coffee maker in the corner confirmed it. 14 minutes, Rebecca said, settling behind her desk. She'd always been precise like that, even in high school when she'd tutored him in calculus. Max chose to stand, his tall frame making the modest office feel even smaller. "I want to buy Heritage House." Rebecca's pen stopped moving mid-note. "You're not serious." "Dead serious. I'll match Criterion's offer, plus an additional $1 million for immediate improvements." "Why?" The question cut through the air between them. "Why now? Why you?" Max had rehearsed a dozen business-rational answers on the drive over, about property values and tax benefits and community goodwill. Instead, he found himself saying, "Because you were right." About what? That night at graduation, when you said I'd become just like my father if I let the business consume me. He moved to the window, looking out at the playground where a fresh group of children was now having recess. "You weren't entirely wrong." Rebecca's chair creaked as she stood. "That was a lifetime ago, Max. We were kids. Kids who knew what mattered." He turned back to face her. "I've spent 25 years building Porter Development into exactly what everyone expected. But this place," he gestured to encompass the building around them. "This matters." "Don't." Rebecca's voice wavered slightly. "And don't pretend this is about anything more than business. When did you become so cynical? When did you become so sentimental?" she countered, but there was less edge to her tone. "The Max Porter I see in the business pages wouldn't waste time on a century-old building that needs a new roof, updated wiring, and probably asbestos removal. The Max Porter you knew wouldn't have either." He stepped closer to her desk. "I was too busy trying to save my father's company to see the bigger picture back then, too focused on survival to think about legacy." Rebecca's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "And now? Now I have the resources to do something that matters. These kids deserve a chance, Rebecca. The same chance you tried to give me when my dad died." The old nickname slipped out before he could catch it, and he saw it land like a physical thing between them. Rebecca turned away, moving to the wall of children's artwork. Her fingers traced the edge of a crayon drawing, showing stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "Danny drew that," she said quietly. "He came to us 3 months ago after his parents died in a car accident. No other family, no insurance, nothing but nightmares and trust issues." She turned back to Max. "These children aren't numbers on a spreadsheet, Max. They're not a tax write-off or a PR opportunity. I know that. Because once you commit to this place, to these children, there's no walking away, no selling when the market improves or when a better opportunity comes along." Her green eyes locked onto his. "Can you promise that?" Before Max could answer, a knock at the door interrupted them. A teenage girl with close-cropped hair and worried eyes poked her head in. "Miss Martinez?" "Amy's having another panic attack." Rebecca moved instantly, maternal instinct overriding their conversation. "Where?" "Music room. Mrs. Chen's with her, but she's asking for you." "I'll be right there." Rebecca paused at the door, looking back at Max. "Stay. This might take a while, but we're not finished." Max watched her hurry down the hall, remembering how she'd had the same determined stride when rushing to student council meetings or diving into community service projects. Some things hadn't changed. Left alone, he studied the office more carefully. Behind Rebecca's desk, partially hidden by a filing cabinet, he spotted a framed newspaper clipping. Moving closer, he recognized his own face, much younger, grinning next to Rebecca as they accepted a community service award for their work at the local food bank. The door creaked, and he turned to find Rebecca watching him, her expression unreadable. "Amy's okay," she said before he could ask. Sometimes the music room reminds her of her grandmother's house. We're working on it. Max nodded, gesturing to the clipping. You kept this. It reminds me why I do this work. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell the faint trace of lavender that had always been her signature. We were going to change the world, remember? One small act of kindness at a time. We still could. The words came out softer than he intended. Let me help, Becca. Not as a businessman, but as someone who remembers what it's like to lose everything and have someone believe in you anyway. Rebecca studied him for a long moment, and he could almost see her weighing the past against the present, measuring sincerity against risk. Finally, she walked to her desk and pulled out a thick folder. This is everything, she said, holding it out to him. Budgets, repairs needed, staff requirements, educational programs. Read it, all of it. Then come back tomorrow and tell me if you're still serious. Max took the folder, his fingers brushing hers briefly. I will. And Max, she called as he reached the door. Thank you for remembering who you wanted to be. He nodded, unable to find the right words to express how much that meant. As he walked back to his car, the weight of the folder in his hands felt like possibility, and maybe, just maybe, a chance at redemption. The Heritage House file lay open on Max's desk at 3 a.m., coffee cups scattered around him like casualties of a late-night siege. He'd been through every page twice, and each review only strengthened his resolve. The financial struggles weren't just about maintenance. They were fighting to provide therapy, educational support, and enrichment programs while operating on a budget that barely covered basics. His phone buzzed. Lawrence. You're not going to like this, his CFO said without preamble. Criterion's moving up their timeline. They're closing the deal Friday. That's 3 days from now. Max sat up straighter. They can, and they are. Word got out about your visit to Heritage House. They're spooked. Max swore under his breath. Get me a meeting with their CEO, tomorrow. Already tried. They're not taking our calls. Lawrence paused. There's something else. I did some digging into the Heritage House financials. Rebecca Martinez has been covering their shortfalls with her personal savings for the past 2 years. She's nearly bankrupt. The revelation hit Max like a physical blow. He thought of Rebecca's sensible clothes, her modest office, the coffee maker that had seen better days. She'd been sacrificing everything while he'd been building his fortune. Get me everything you can on Criterion's board members. And Lawrence? Wake up our legal team. Dawn found Max pulling into Heritage House's parking lot, the early morning light painting the old building in shades of gold. A small figure sat on the front steps. Danny, the boy who'd asked if Max was a prince. You came back, Danny said as Max approached. I did. Is Miss Martinez here? Danny nodded. She's always here early. She's making breakfast, 'cause Mrs. Rodriguez is sick. Max followed the smell of coffee and pancakes to the kitchen, where he found Rebecca expertly flipping pancakes while simultaneously helping a young girl with what appeared to be math homework. So, if Jenny has 12 apples and gives 3 to Michael, how many? Rebecca looked up, surprise flickering across her face. Max, can we talk? Rebecca glanced at the girl. Lisa, why don't you go see if anyone else is ready for breakfast? Once they were alone, Rebecca turned back to the stove, her shoulders tense. You're here early. Why didn't you tell me how bad things were? Max moved beside her, taking in the industrial-sized kitchen that had clearly seen better days. That you've been keeping this place afloat with your own money? The spatula clattered against the griddle. Who told you that? Does it matter? Becca, you're going to lose everything. I've been losing things my whole life, Max. I'm good at it. She retrieved the spatula, her movements sharp. Besides, after Friday, it won't matter anyway. About that. Max leaned against the counter. Criterion's moving up the timeline. They're closing the deal Friday. Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she flipped another pancake. 3 days? But we were promised 2 weeks to find alternative housing for... She stopped, composing herself. Right, of course. Business is business. Not this time. Max gently took the spatula from her hand. I have a plan, but I need you to trust me." "Trust you?" Rebecca turned to face him fully. "Like I trusted you 25 years ago, when you disappeared without a word." The old pain in her voice made him wince. "I wrote you letters. Dozens of them. I never got any letters. I never sent them." The confession hung between them. "I was drowning. Becca, the business was failing. Creditors were calling. And I couldn't." He ran a hand through his hair. "I couldn't drag you down with me. You had your scholarship, your dreams. I thought I was protecting you." "You didn't protect me, Max. You underestimated me." Rebecca's voice softened. "I would have helped. We could have figured it out together." Before Max could respond, a small commotion erupted in the dining room. Rebecca moved to check, but Max caught her arm. "Let me help now," he said quietly. "Please." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Max saw the girl who had believed in him when no one else did. Then Rebecca pulled away. "The children need breakfast," she said, "and I need you to be sure about this, really sure. Because if you do this, if you save Heritage House, you're not just buying a building, you're becoming part of these children's lives, their stability, their future. I know. Do you? Because Danny already asks about you every day. Lisa thinks you're going to teach her business math. And Amy?" Rebecca's voice caught. "Amy started drawing again after you left yesterday. First time in months." The weight of responsibility in her words sobered him. "I have a meeting with my legal team at 9. By this afternoon, I'll have a plan to stop Criterion. But Becca?" He waited until she looked at him again. "I'm not just here to save Heritage House. I'm here because 25 years ago, I made the biggest mistake of my life walking away from someone who saw the best in me." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, but before she could respond, a small voice called from the dining room. "Miss Becca." Tommy put syrup in Rachel's hair. A ghost of a smile crossed Rebecca's face. "Duty calls." She started toward the door, then paused. "The letters. Do you still have them?" Max nodded. "Bring them," she said softly. "When this is all over, bring them." As she hurried to handle the breakfast crisis, Max pulled out his phone. He had calls to make, favors to call in, and a real estate deal to stop. But for the first time in 25 years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He just hoped 3 days would be enough time to prove it. Absolutely not. Richard Whitman, Criterion's CEO, stood behind his mahogany desk like a general commanding his troops. "The deal closes Friday. End of discussion." Max kept his voice level, though his fingers tightened around the folder in his hands. "I'm prepared to offer 20% above your current bid. This isn't about money, Porter." Whitman's smile didn't reach his eyes. "This is about sending a message. You can't swoop in and disrupt legitimate business deals because of, what? Nostalgia. A guilty conscience." "Actually," Max placed a document on Whitman's desk. Your environmental impact study is incomplete. Specifically, the section about potential groundwater contamination from the underground heating oil tanks, Heritage House used in the 1950s. Whitman's smile faltered. "Our engineers never found them because they're not in the current blueprints. But they exist." Max laid down another document. "And according to Massachusetts state law, any property sale involving undisclosed environmental hazards can be delayed pending a full investigation." "You're bluffing." "Try me." Max met Whitman's glare. "A delay could take months. Your investors might start asking uncomfortable questions." The ensuing silence stretched until Whitman finally spoke. "What do you want?" 2 weeks. "Stop the Friday closing. Give me 2 weeks to arrange financing, and I'll handle the tank removal myself." 1 week, Whitman countered, "and if you can't close by then, you back off. Completely." Max extended his hand. "Deal." Outside Criterion's office tower, Max loosened his tie and called Rebecca. "We have a week," he said when she answered. "I bought us that much time." Her exhale of relief crackled through the phone. "How did you— Never mind. I don't want to know. Listen, can you come by the house? There's something you need to see." An hour later, Max followed Rebecca through Heritage House's basement, their path lit by industrial flashlights. The air was thick with decades of dust and disuse. "Watch your head," Rebecca warned, ducking under a low pipe. Mrs. Chen found these while looking for old records. She pointed her flashlight at a stack of leather-bound books. They're the original ledgers from when Heritage House opened in 1902. Max picked up the top volume, carefully opening its brittle pages. Why are these important? Because Rebecca's flashlight beam highlighted a particular entry. According to this, Heritage House was designated as a historical landmark in 1927. The designation was never properly recorded with the city, but if we can prove it, Criterion couldn't demolish it even if they owned it. Max finished, excitement building. "Becca, this is brilliant. There's more." She moved deeper into the basement to a wall covered in old photographs. "Look at these names. The children who passed through here. Some of them went on to become mayors, congressmen, business leaders. Heritage House isn't just a building. It's part of Boston's history." Max studied the photographs, recognizing several prominent Boston family names. Then his eye caught something else, a small group photo from the 1960s. In it, a teenage boy with familiar features stood proudly in front of Heritage House. "Is that your father?" Rebecca confirmed softly. "I found it this morning. According to the records, he stayed here for 6 months after his parents died, before his aunt could take him in." Max stared at the image of his father, young, vulnerable, so different from the hard-driving businessman he'd known. "He never told me." "Maybe he couldn't." Rebecca touched his arm gently. "Some pain runs too deep to share." Max thought of all the times his father had pushed him to be tougher, more business-minded. Had he been trying to protect him from the same vulnerability he'd experienced? A crash from upstairs interrupted his thoughts, followed by children's voices raised in alarm. "The art room," Rebecca said, already moving. They rushed upstairs to find water pouring from a burst pipe in the ceiling, threatening the children's artwork and supplies. "Everyone out," Rebecca directed, while Max stripped off his suit jacket and tried to contain the spray. For the next hour, they worked with staff and older children to save what they could and minimize the damage. Later, as a plumber worked on temporary repairs, Max found Rebecca in her office, surveying the water damage to her ceiling. "Add it to the list," she said wearily. "At least no one was hurt." "I'm starting to understand why you've been using your savings," Max said. "Why didn't you apply for grants, historical preservation funds?" "I did, all of them, but without proof of the historical designation," she shrugged. "Most foundations want guaranteed longevity before they'll invest." Max watched her organize salvaged artwork, noting the careful way she handled each piece. "You've been fighting this battle alone for a long time, haven't you?" "Not alone. The staff, the volunteers, everyone here believes in what we're doing." She looked up at him. "But yes, it's been challenging." "That stops now." Max pulled out his phone. "I'm calling in my restoration team. They can start assessing the building tonight." "Max, we can't afford—" "I can." He met her gaze. "Let me do this, Becca. Not just for the children or the history, but for my father. And for us." Rebecca's expression softened. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out." "Figure what out?" "Why this place matters so much to you." She smiled slightly. "You're not just saving an orphanage, Max. You're healing something that was broken a long time ago." Before he could respond, Danny appeared in the doorway, clutching a slightly water-damaged drawing. "I saved it, Miss Becca." He held up the picture proudly. "It's for Mr. Max. See? It's him saving our house from the bad guys." Max knelt to examine the crayon masterpiece, where a distinctly superhero-like figure stood guard over a large building filled with smiling faces. The lump in his throat made it hard to speak. "Thank you, Danny," he managed. "This is exactly what I needed today." As Danny beamed and ran off to share his artistic triumph with others, Max stood and faced Rebecca. "1 week," he said. "Give me 1 week to prove that some things are worth saving." Rebecca's smile reached her eyes this time. "We already know they are, Max. But okay, 1 week." As Max headed to meet his restoration team, Danny's drawing tucked carefully in his briefcase, he realized Rebecca was right. He wasn't just saving Heritage House. He was finding pieces of himself he thought he'd lost forever. Now he just had to make sure they had enough time to put them all back together. The Historical Preservation Office was a maze of filing cabinets and dust-covered boxes, where 2 city archivists had been helping Max search for 3 hours. His suit was streaked with grime, and his patience was wearing thin. If the designation existed, it would be here, the senior archivist said, pushing her glasses up her nose. We've checked every record from 1925 to 1930. Max's phone buzzed. Lawrence again. He'd been calling hourly with updates on potential investors, each one more discouraging than the last. The historical designation was becoming their only hope. What about alternative records? Max asked. City council minutes, property tax assessments, anything? The younger archivist looked up from his computer. There might be something in the microfiche archives at the main library. News coverage from the designation ceremony. Max checked his watch. The library closed in an hour. Thank you both, he said, already heading for the door. Send me your bill. His phone rang again as he rushed down the stairs. Rebecca, tell me you found something, she said without preamble. Not yet, but I'm heading to the library. How are things there? The restoration team says the foundation is solid, but the electrical system needs to be completely replaced. She paused. And Max? Criterion's board chairman just left. Max stopped walking. What did he want? To offer me a job, running their new community outreach program. He said it would be a shame to waste my experience in social services. The implied threat was clear. They were trying to remove Rebecca from the equation. What did you tell him? I told him I already had a job. Her voice softened. One I believe in. Max leaned against the stairwell wall, closing his eyes briefly. Becca, if this doesn't work, it will, she interrupted. It has to. Oh, and Amy asked if you're coming to her piano recital tomorrow. The sudden change of subject caught him off guard. Piano recital? She's been practicing for weeks. It's her first time performing since... Rebecca's voice trailed off. Since before she lost her grandmother. I told her you might be too busy, but... What time? 4 o'clock, but... Max, the library. I'll be there, he promised. For both, I can multitask. The next afternoon found Max in Heritage House's music room, his laptop open on his knees as he scrolled through digitized newspapers from 1927. Amy sat at the upright piano, her small fingers moving carefully over the keys as she played Moonlight Sonata. The other children sat cross-legged on the floor, unusually quiet. Rebecca stood in the doorway, and even from across the room, Max could see the pride in her eyes. As Amy played the final notes, the room erupted in applause. She ducked her head, smiling shyly, then looked directly at Max. Did you like it? She asked softly. Max closed his laptop. It was beautiful, Amy. Your grandmother would have been very proud. Amy's eyes filled with tears, but her smile grew. She rushed over and hugged him, catching Max by surprise. Over her head, he saw Rebecca watching them, her own eyes suspiciously bright. Later, after the children had gone to dinner, Max found Rebecca in the garden, sitting on the same checkered blanket where he'd first seen her days ago. Amy's teacher says she hasn't played for anyone since the accident, Rebecca said as he sat beside her. She was afraid of the memories. She's stronger than she knows, Max said. They all are. They have to be. Rebecca pulled her knees to her chest, looking younger suddenly. When I first started here, I thought I could fix everything, make up for every loss, heal every hurt. But sometimes all we can do is be there. Show them they're not alone. Like you were there for me, Max asked quietly. Rebecca turned to look at him. You remember? The day of my father's funeral. You found me in the school parking lot, trying to figure out how to tell our teachers I was dropping out. He smiled slightly. You brought me a turkey sandwich and made me eat it before we talked about anything else. You hadn't eaten in 2 days, Rebecca said. I was worried. You were always worried about everyone else. Max hesitated, then reached into his briefcase. That's why I kept these. He pulled out a bundle of envelopes, held together with a faded rubber band. Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she took them. "The letters you never sent." "Read them," Max said softly. "When you have time, they might help explain everything." Before Rebecca could respond, Max's phone chimed with an email alert. He opened it, then sat up straighter. The library found something. A photograph from the Boston Globe, December 1927. He turned his phone to show her. "Look at the banner." Rebecca leaned closer, reading aloud. "Heritage House receives historical landmark status. Max, this is it." "Maybe." He was already dialing his lawyer. "If we can prove the designation was official, not just ceremonial." Rebecca touched his arm. "Even if we can't, what you've done here, it matters. You've given these children something they desperately need." "What's that?" "Hope." She smiled. "And maybe you've given us both a second chance, too." Max covered her hand with his, and for a moment, they sat in comfortable silence as the evening settled around them. Then his phone rang, Lawrence again, and reality intruded. "Go," Rebecca said, standing. "Save our home. I have letters to read." As Max hurried to his car, he glanced back to see Rebecca settling onto a garden bench, carefully opening the first letter. 25 years of unspoken words were finally finding their way home. He just hoped they had enough time for everything else to fall into place too. The newspaper photograph was their miracle, until it wasn't. "Ceremonial designation only," Max's lawyer said, her voice tired after hours of research. "Without official city council records, the historical status won't hold up legally." Max stood at his office window, watching dawn break over Boston's skyline. They had 48 hours left before Criterion's deadline. There has to be something else. "There might be." Lawrence entered, tablet in hand. "But you're not going to like it." The proposal he outlined made Max's jaw clench. A complex leveraged buyout involving most of his personal assets, including his penthouse and his stake in 3 other development projects. "If anything goes wrong," Lawrence warned, "you'll lose everything. If we do nothing, 38 children lose their home." Max studied the numbers. "How fast can you put this together?" 24 hours minimum. "But Max," Lawrence hesitated. "There's something else." Rebecca Martinez's name came up in my research. She was engaged, 15 years ago, to Richard Whitman. The revelation hit Max like a physical blow. Whitman, Criterion's CEO. Their engagement ended abruptly, Lawrence continued, right after she took the position at Heritage House. Max's phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "We need to talk. Can you come by?" 20 minutes later, he found her in Heritage House's library, early morning light streaming through stained glass windows. She looked like she hadn't slept. "You read the letters," he said. Rebecca nodded. "All night. But that's not..." She took a deep breath. "Richard came to see me again." "Whitman." Max kept his voice neutral. "Your ex-fiancé." She flinched slightly. "You know." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it didn't matter. That was another life." She paced between the bookshelves. "He offered to save Heritage House. Said Criterion would renovate instead of demolish, create a modern facility. In exchange for what? For me." Rebecca's laugh was bitter. "To run it, to be the face of their charitable giving, to be his wife, like I was supposed to be before I chose this place over him." Max felt something cold settle in his chest. And I told him to leave." She finally met Max's eyes. "I chose Heritage House over him once before. I'd do it again. But Max," he said something else. "About you. That I'm losing everything to save this place." At her startled look, he smiled grimly. "He's right. The deal I'm putting together, it's not just risky. If it fails, I lose everything I've built. You can't do that." "Actually, I can, and I will." Max moved closer. "But first I need to know something. Those letters I wrote. The last one. Did you read it?" Color touched Rebecca's cheeks. "Yes." And I think you were right." She touched his arm. "We were too young then, too focused on different dreams. But now..." The library door burst open, interrupting them. Danny ran in, tears streaming down his face. "Miss Becca, they're taking Amy." They found Amy in the entrance hall, clinging to Mrs. Chen while two social workers tried to explain something about emergency placement orders. Her aunt was located in California, one worker said. But she's agreed to take custody. Without any preparation, any transition time, Rebecca's voice shook with anger. Amy's been through enough trauma. The aunt insisted on immediate placement. The social worker looked uncomfortable. Given the uncertain situation here, Max watched Amy's face crumple as she understood what was happening. Without thinking, he stepped forward. "Give us 24 hours, he said. "Let her aunt fly here, meet Amy in familiar surroundings. Let us help Amy prepare." "We have orders." "I'll call the judge myself," Max interrupted. "I know Margaret Wilson. She'll understand the need for trauma-informed transition." The standoff lasted several tense minutes before the social workers reluctantly agreed to delay until tomorrow. As they left, Amy launched herself at Max, sobbing, "I don't want to go. Please don't make me go." Max held her, meeting Rebecca's eyes over Amy's head. The pain he saw there matched his own. Later, after they'd calmed Amy and gotten her settled with Mrs. Chen for art therapy, Rebecca found Max in her office. "You know Margaret Wilson?" she asked. "No." Max loosened his tie. "But they didn't know that." Rebecca's laugh was watery. "You're not the man you pretend to be in those business magazines, are you? Neither are you the woman Richard Whitman wants you to be." Max checked his phone. Dozens of missed calls from Lawrence. "I have to go. The buyout papers." "Wait." Rebecca touched his hand. "That last letter. The one where you said you'd love me forever, even if we never met again." She took a shaky breath. "I feel the same way. I always have. But I can't let you sacrifice everything for this place." "It's not a sacrifice if it's for something that matters." Max squeezed her hand. "And these kids, this place, you, it all matters." "Max, hold that thought." He smiled. "Give me 24 hours to save our home. Then we can talk about forever." As he drove back to his office, Max's phone rang. "Lawrence. Whitman's lawyers reached out," his CFO said. "They want a meeting. Tonight." Max thought of Amy's tears, of Rebecca's face when she talked about choosing Heritage House, of all the children who needed this place to be their sanctuary. "Set it up," he said. "And Lawrence, get me everything you can on emergency child placement orders in Massachusetts. Everything." He had 24 hours to save not just a building, but a family. All of them. Win or lose, he was finally fighting for what mattered most. The conference room at Criterion Properties felt like a war room, with lawyers flanking both sides of the table. Richard Whitman sat at its head, radiating smug confidence. "Let's be clear," Whitman said, sliding a document across the polished surface. "This is a courtesy meeting. In 18 hours, Heritage House becomes Criterion Property unless you can match our offer, which we both know you can't." Max left the document untouched. "Actually, I can. My lawyers are finalizing the paperwork now." "By leveraging everything you own." Whitman's smile was razor sharp. "That's not just desperate, Porter. It's foolish. One market downturn, one missed payment, and you lose it all." "Maybe." Max leaned forward. "But I also know about the 7 other historical properties Criterion's demolished in the past 3 years. Properties that had children's programs, community services, all replaced with luxury condos." Whitman's smile faltered slightly. "Legal development projects. Legal, yes, but terrible PR, especially when packaged with Heritage House's history. Did you know my father lived there?" Max watched Whitman's expression carefully. "I wonder how your shareholders would feel about demolishing a century-old children's home with that kind of story. Especially when there's a viable alternative. Are you threatening me? I'm offering you a way out. Accept my matching bid, let me take Heritage House, and I'll keep the history of those other properties quiet." Whitman stood abruptly. "Get out of my office." "One more thing." Max remained seated. "The emergency placement order for Amy Chen. I know you called in a favor with family services. Using a child as leverage, that's low, even for you. Prove it. Whitman's voice was ice. Now get out before I have security remove you. Max drove straight to Heritage House, arriving just before midnight. Light still burned in Rebecca's office window. He found her surrounded by papers, her hair twisted up with a pencil holding it in place. "I've been through every document we have," she said without looking up. "Property records, tax assessments, donation records. There has to be something we missed about the historical designation." "Becca." Max gently took the papers from her hands. "Stop." She looked up then, and he saw the shadows under her eyes. "I can't. Amy's aunt arrives tomorrow morning, and Criterion." "I met with Whitman." Max perched on the edge of her desk. "It didn't go well. He's not going to stop, is he?" Rebecca ran a hand through her hair, dislodging the pencil. "This is my fault. If I hadn't ended things with him." "Hey." Max caught her hand. "You ended things because he wanted you to be someone you're not. That's not your fault. But now everyone's paying the price. Amy, the other children, you." Her voice caught. "I read your last letter again. The part where you said some dreams are worth any sacrifice. I meant it then. I mean it now. That's what I'm afraid of." Rebecca stood, moving to the window. "I saw the buyout terms, Max. Lawrence showed me. You're not just risking your money. You're risking everything you've built, your future." "No." Max joined her at the window. "I'm investing in my future. The right one, this time." A soft knock interrupted them. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway, her face tight with worry. "Amy's missing." The next hour was chaos. Staff searched every room while police took descriptions and asked questions. Max found himself in Amy's room, studying the small details of her life, the stuffed rabbit on her bed, sheet music carefully stacked on her desk, a photo of her grandmother on the nightstand. Then he noticed something else. The piano music from her recital was gone. "The music room," he said suddenly. "Has anyone checked?" Rebecca was already moving. They found Amy there, curled up under the piano, clutching her sheet music. "I can't leave," she whispered, as Rebecca knelt beside her. "Grandma taught me piano here. If I go to California, I'll forget how to play. I'll forget her." "Oh, sweetheart," Rebecca gathered her close. "Your grandmother is in your heart, not just in this room. And you carry music inside you. No one can take that away." Max watched them, something tightening in his chest. Then his phone buzzed. Lawrence. "Tell me you have good news," Max answered quietly. "Better than good? You need to see this, now." "I can't leave." "Trust me," Lawrence interrupted. "This changes everything." Max looked at Rebecca and Amy, still huddled together under the piano. "Give me 20 minutes." Rebecca caught his eye as he turned to go. Max, I'll be back," he promised. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'll be back." The drive to his office felt endless. But when Lawrence showed him what he'd found, Max understood the urgency. There, in a forgotten corner of Boston's digital archives, was a single document that would change everything. Max read it 3 times to be sure. Then he called Rebecca. "Get everyone together," he said when she answered. "Staff, children, everyone. I'm on my way back. And Becca, tell Amy to get her piano ready." "Max, what?" "Trust me," he said softly. "Some dreams are worth staying up for." As he drove back through Boston's quiet streets, Max smiled for the first time in hours. Sometimes the best sacrifices were the ones you didn't have to make after all. Dawn was breaking, and with it would come either an ending or a beginning. Finally, he knew which one it would be. The Heritage House dining room had never been so full at 5 a.m. Children in pajamas sat beside bleary-eyed staff members, while Amy perched at the upright piano that had been wheeled in from the music room. Rebecca stood near the door, confusion warring with exhaustion on her face. Max burst in, Lawrence right behind him with a laptop. "Sorry I'm late," Max said, scanning the room. "Is Amy's aunt here yet?" "Her flight lands in an hour," Rebecca replied. Max said, "What's going on?" Instead of answering, Max turned to the assembled group. 25 years ago, I made a mistake. I thought I had to choose between success and what really mattered." He met Rebecca's eyes. "I was wrong." He nodded to Lawrence, who connected his laptop to the room's ancient projector. A document appeared on the wall. In 1927, Heritage House received its historical designation, but that wasn't all. Max stepped closer to the projection. The original founder, Elizabeth Heritage, didn't just want to create a home for children. She wanted to ensure it would always remain one. Rebecca moved forward, reading aloud from the projected text, "In perpetuity, this property shall serve as a sanctuary for children in need, supported by an endowment equal to the property's assessed value." The endowment was lost in the Depression, Max continued. Or so everyone thought. But Elizabeth Heritage was smarter than that. She placed the funds in a trust, managed by multiple banks, with strict requirements for its discovery. Lawrence pulled up another document. The trust could only be accessed when Heritage House faced demolition, and only by someone who could prove both personal connection to the home and financial commitment to its mission. "Like someone whose father lived here," Rebecca breathed. "And who was willing to risk everything to save it," Max smiled. The trust's current value, with 97 years of compound interest, is more than enough to buy Heritage House and fund its operations for the next century. The room erupted in chaos. Children cheered without fully understanding why. Staff members hugged each other, and Mrs. Chen burst into tears. But Max wasn't finished. "Amy," he turned to the piano. "Remember how you played Moonlight Sonata for us? Elizabeth Heritage wrote in her will that music should always be part of this home. That's why there's always been a piano here, through every hardship." Amy's fingers touched the keys tentatively. "So, I don't have to leave?" "No, sweetheart," Rebecca answered, her own voice thick with emotion. "This is your home for as long as you need it." "Actually," Max pulled out his phone, showing them an email. "Your aunt asked if she could move to Boston instead. She's been looking for a fresh start, and there's a music teacher position open at Brighton High." Amy's face lit up. Then she began to play, not Moonlight Sonata this time, but a joyful improvisation that filled the room with hope. The front door burst open, revealing Richard Whitman with 2 lawyers in tow. He stopped short at the scene before him. "You're too late," Max said quietly. "Heritage House is no longer for sale. In fact, it was never really for sale in the first place." Lawrence handed Whitman a copy of the trust documents. As he read, his face went from red to white. "This is impossible," he sputtered. "No," Rebecca stepped forward. "This is justice. Elizabeth Heritage protected her legacy better than any of us knew. She just needed the right person to discover it." "The right people," Max corrected, taking her hand. After Whitman and his lawyers retreated, after the celebration died down and the children were sent to get ready for breakfast, Max found Rebecca in the garden where everything had begun. "You knew," she said. "When you called last night, you knew we'd won. I knew we had a chance." He sat beside her on the checkered blanket. "But I meant what I said about choosing what matters. Trust fund or not, I would have found a way to save this place. Because of your father? Because of all of it. Him, these children, this place." He turned to face her fully. "You." Rebecca's smile was like sunrise. "So, what happens now?" "Now?" Max reached into his pocket and pulled out one final letter, unopened. "There's one more letter I never sent. I wrote it last night, before I knew about the trust." Rebecca took it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sentence. "Some dreams are worth waiting 25 years to come true." "I was going to give you this after I signed away everything to save Heritage House," Max said softly. "Because losing my fortune to save this place, to be with you, wasn't really losing at all. And now? Now we have a century of funding, 38 children who need us, and a lot of time to make up for." He took her hand. "Starting with replacing that ancient coffee maker in your office." Rebecca laughed through tears. "That coffee maker has character." "So do we." Max pulled her close. "And we have all the time in the world to prove it." In the distance, Amy's piano music drifted through an open window, mixing with the sounds of children preparing for a new day. The morning sun caught the red bricks of Heritage House, making them glow like they were newly laid. Rebecca leaned her head on Max's shoulder. Elizabeth Heritage would be proud. Of the trust fund? Of what it protected. Not just the building, but the heart of this place. The hope it gives. Max kissed her temple. Some legacies are worth protecting. Some dreams are worth waiting for, Rebecca countered, quoting his letter. Inside, the day was beginning. There would be paperwork to file, renovations to plan, and 38 stories to continue nurturing. But for now, they sat in the garden where their second chance had begun, listening to the music of new beginnings. After all, the best dreams aren't just about happy endings. They're about all the moments that follow, the quiet triumphs, the small victories, and the daily miracle of hearts finding their way home. Heritage House would stand another 100 years, its red bricks and white trim sheltering generation after generation of children who needed hope. And in its garden, on a checkered blanket that had seen its share of stories, two people who had always been meant to find their way back to each other finally had all the time in the world to write their own.